Just last week, we talked about a new study from Transport and Environment that used data collected for it by emissions analytics to investigate the real-world emissions of 3 plug-in hybrid SUVs, 2 of which, as some of you noted in the comments, are performance plug-in hybrids. The results of that study were used to argue that subsidies for plug-in hybrids should be immediately stopped and that plug-in hybrids emit far more emissions than their official ratings and sales stickers suggest. In order to deeper examine what was going on, I spent some time reading that report and its associated paperwork, concluding that the study in many ways was flawed, since not all plug-in hybrids are created equally. Some plug-in hybrids operate as purely electric vehicles and have great range before their engine kicks in, while others, including the 3 in the study, turn their engines on at the smallest provocation. And I noted that it's often down to the individual owner as to just how bad the car's emissions are over its lifetime, commenting that many people I know with plug-in hybrids do everything they possibly can to operate in all-electric mode 90+% of the time. That study and the video we produced on it caused a sea of divergent comments, and I suspect we're going to see that again today as there's yet another study that's causing big waves in the clean and plug-in vehicle world. Enter the Decarbonising Transport report as published in the last week and as reported in several UK newspapers over the weekend. 21 pages in length, it's a very different beast to the 100-page report and 100 pages of research that I covered last week. Its focus? Well, in its introduction, in response to recent UK government goals set for the decarbonisation of both the transportation and energy sectors, it states that while the UK automotive industry is, quote, fully committed to the decarbonisation of its products while also minimising the environmental impact of its operations, end quote, it believes that, quote, tailpipe emissions are not the whole story. To back up its claims, it examines the various fuel options available in the marketplace in the UK today, from fossil fuels through to battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And it makes some pretty outlandish claims about the various options available. For example, it quotes a Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders report from September that says electrifying the UK fleet would require £16.7 billion sterling of investment in electric vehicle charging networks, while focusing on hydrogen fuel cell network refuelling by converting existing petrol stations to being hydrogen fuel cell filling stations would cost approximately £19.1 billion. It also claims that biofuels and e-fuels, while more expensive than a hydrogen fuel cell future, are still more expensive than fossil fuels at an average cost per litre of around £5 sterling. If your eyebrows are raising up, then you would not be alone. And it gets better, or rather even more bizarre. One of its highlight points is that diesel vehicles emit on average 15 to 20% less carbon dioxide than a petrol vehicle, and it cites the SMMT as its source of that particular information. If you follow the link, you're presented with the same claim found in the report, but no link backs to any scientific study validating those claims. Yet a study by the International Council on Clean Transportation proved exactly the opposite in 2019, testing a Euro 6b compliant diesel Volkswagen Golf from around 2016 against a Euro 6 compliant petrol Volkswagen Golf from 2018. It discovered that not only did the diesel engine emit more carbon dioxide per kilometre travelled than the petrol engine in real-world conditions, but that the gasoline engine emitted far less than its diesel counterpart in the lab as well. As a side, that ICCT study also notes that both vehicles produced far more emissions on the road than the official fuel economy tests suggest, with both vehicles emitting between 24 and 39% more than official targets set for official type approval in Europe. For those who don't know, type approval is essentially a part of the process that each new car model must go through prior to official sales launch. This is to make sure that it's deemed in compliance with the various emissions and safety regulations that exist in Europe. And as a side to my side, that ICCT study I just quoted, it came to one of the same conclusions that the study I covered last week did, namely that official fuel economy tests and emissions tests are completely unrealistic in real-world driving. And remember that fact, because I'll come back to it later. Back to the Decarbonising Transport report, which I should reiterate does not rely on any first-hand information, only cherry-picked stuff from elsewhere. Its biggest faux pas, at least in the world of EVs, is to bring up the old chestnut of wheel-to-well emissions, doing no research of itself but pulling figures out of other companies' reports and research data massaging to the max. One of the data sources it quotes, Polestar's Exceptional Life Cycle Assessment Survey for the Polestar 2 electric car, as released by the automaker in September this year. It uses a chart from that LCA to argue that electric vehicles are responsible for far more emissions during manufacturing than internal combustion engine vehicles are, and claims, citing that data, that you would have to drive a Polestar 2 78,000 kilometres, which is about 48,467 miles or thereabouts, before the Polestar 2 produced fewer emissions over its lifetime than an internal combustion engine Volvo XC40. That's assuming you charged said Polestar 2 exclusively using the standard EU28 electricity mix in Europe, which of course led to a huge number of British newspapers running their favourite headlines decrying electric cars as expensive and no better than an internal combustion engine vehicle. It's not helped either by the fact that Brits drive very little, compared to some nations in the world, I mean, which means that the alleged break-even point from the Decarbonising Transport report would take years to reach. And yes, I really do mean years. According to the UK government's Department for Transport, the average motorist drove just 7,400 miles in their car last year in the UK, just shy of 12,000 kilometres, meaning that 78,000 kilometre break-even point would take more than 6.5 years to reach. And unlike Americans, who tend to keep their cars between 7 and 8.5 years, depending on who you ask, the RAC Foundation in the UK says that Brits keep their cars just 4 years on average. RAC standing for the Royal Automobile Club, which is a fairly well-respected motoring organisation, motoring services company, and breakdown assistance service. But stop. Because the original report written by Polestar, something which includes both Polestar's data and methodology, which frankly makes it far better than most reports issued by automakers to date when it comes to life cycle analysis, doesn't say just that. Yes, the table is there, it's in the executive summary, but if you scroll down to the actual part of the report where Polestar discusses lifetime emissions, well, things get interesting. While it does reproduce the chart showing total greenhouse gas emissions over the distance travelled, and yes, seems to suggest a break-even point for emissions is at the same point as quoted by Decarbonising Transport, it's far less for a vehicle powered by renewable energy. And it also shows that when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions over the lifetime of the vehicle, the Polestar 2 is responsible for a reduction of between 8 tonnes of carbon dioxide over a 200,000 kilometre lifetime in its worst case scenario, and a reduction of 31 tonnes of carbon dioxide over 200,000 kilometres lifetime when compared to a petrol XC40. As Polestar's CEO Ingelath Thomas notes in a post in LinkedIn over the weekend, Polestar's LCA is quoted by Decarbonising Transportation's report, but doesn't report any of the context or the CO2 impact listed in the report. And as Oka Hoekstra, Director of Research at neonresearch.nl and founder of Zenmo Research, and an electric vehicle researcher at TU Eindhoven, essentially someone who is not only just a real-world researcher, but also someone who works to debunk studies like this regularly, notes that the Polestar 2 emissions figures quoted for the Volvo XC40, which of course use official WLTP test figures, are woefully inadequate. Remember, those 2 studies I noted earlier? They all showcase the same thing in a very simple way, illustrating that real-world internal combustion engine emissions are far worse than any official economy and emissions tests would suggest. On his Twitter stream, Oka, sorry if I have pronounced it incorrectly, suggests that the break-even point in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions for the Polestar 2 versus the Volvo XC40, using more realistic emission figures, is closer to about 25,000 kilometres, which is 16,000 miles using the current European energy grid mix. It's even less if you use renewables. Which leaves us where? A document that's easily mistaken for research, but which isn't, produced by a group of British motoring companies and organisations, including the Renewable Transport Fuel Association, which is an advocacy group for biofuels. Then there's Optare, a bus manufacturer, which offers a range of different vehicles, including battery electric and internal combustion engine buses. It was once known as Leyland Motor Company, in case you were interested, and which literally just changed its name, as in yesterday, to Switch Mobility Limited. Also funding the report, racing car specialist and boutique hypercar company McLaren, the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, Leaders Live, which is a, quote, independent thought leadership platform that explores business innovation and technology through conversation, as well-known Tier 1 parts supplier Bosch, Honda, and Aston Martin. Sending the report out on behalf of all of these, well, that's Clarendon Communications. At one point, most automakers had their own press teams, folks who'd worked in the automotive industry for years and who knew everyone who worked at their respective companies. They'd use external PR firms for big events, working alongside rather than relying on said firms to help out at car launches, motor shows, and other important things. The members of the in-house PR teams knew their local media, their respective beats and interests, and generally helped make it easier for people like me to do their job. And if there was a joint announcement from multiple companies through some kind of trade organisation, well, then the trade organisation would have handled things. These days, things are very different. While automakers do still have press and media teams on payroll, more is handled by external communication companies. And so, when I'm reading a report or a statement like this, I'm frankly no longer surprised if it comes from a firm that I've not actually heard of before. But as discovered over the weekend, the head of Clarendon Communications, Rebecca Stevens, has listed her company's address in a building that is co-owned by James Stevens, presumably her husband, who happens to be a senior executive at Aston Martin. Since that bombshell has dropped, the companies listed in the report, the other ones, have been working hard to distance themselves from it. Honda said it provided input to the study but didn't provide any financial help. The Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership has really backpedaled its support by issuing some pretty vague public statements. And Aston Martin has said it did not contract Clarendon Communications to distribute the report, and has quoted no formal links to the PR firm. The whole thing is a shambles, and frankly smells of a paid attempt to try and dissuade the UK government from bringing forward its plans to ban the sale of brand new internal combustion engine vehicles. A plan spearheaded by Aston Martin under its new CEO, Tobias Moers, who replaced the pro-EV Andy Palmer, who had long been a supporter of plug-in vehicles and was often credited as being the leading force behind the development of the Nissan NV200 and Nissan Leaf before leaving Nissan in 2014. Under Andy Palmer, Aston Martin planned the Rapide e-electric car, but it was cancelled amidst financial problems at Aston Martin in January this year, shortly before Andy Palmer left. Andy recently joined Switch Mobility as a non-executive chairman and is said to be working to help reposition that company to focus more on electric buses, hence apparently yesterday's name switch. But whichever way you cut it, it doesn't look good. So when someone inevitably tries to quote the Decarbonising Transport report at you, well, just point them here instead. That's it for today's video. As always, thanks to the folks on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month Patreon supporters. Special thanks to our $50 a month patrons, John Lyons, Regine Fellows, Jeffrey Songster, and Tazla in the Gong. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month Patreon supporters. That's Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback, Sean Ueda, Will Graylin, and Ian. You can join all of these amazing Patreon supporters by following the links below, or you can use them to send us a donation through Ko-fi or Bitcoin. You'll also find a link to our free Discord server, so sign up and come and join in the fun. And as usual, if you're in need of some swag, don't forget to check out our merch store over at redbubble.com. After the names have finished scrolling, you'll see a video suggestion for you to watch, so please consider watching it if you haven't. and I will be back very soon. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving!